I now look to Kaleem Hawa, Lincoln College, to open the case for the proposition.
On December 14th, 2012, a 20-year-old man in Newtown, Connecticut, entered an elementary school called Sandy Hook. There, wielding a semi-automatic rifle, he shot and killed 20 students, as well as 6 teachers and staff members. It was one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. After strong indication from the Obama administration that they would be pursuing comprehensive gun control measures in the wake of the shooting, the National Rifle Association launched a vehement Second Amendment defense of gun ownership and a liberty-based argument in favor of expanding, not reducing, the number of guns and the number of firearms being used. To all who sought to restrict this constitutionally enshrined freedom, Wayne LaPierre, the executive vice president of the NRA, famously replied, "The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun." I mention this tragedy to remind everyone of 2 things. First, that the concept of liberty is not about you. The other side has tried and will try to frame this debate as being about you. You are law-abiding, aren't you? Why should you accept restrictions on your freedoms, on your privacy? But what they're missing is that it always seems like a bad deal to ask comfortable and secure people to think long-term. We are a group of very privileged individuals with very little to fear, living in one of the safest and freest periods in human history. Obviously, we wouldn't think it necessary to limit our own rights, but yet we refuse to admit to ourselves that in many ways, the peacefulness of our current existence owes itself to the very government restrictions that we are debating tonight. What is a more interesting discussion, therefore, to have is whether the concessions to liberty we have made over time have driven the type of security gains that we would want if we were designing the social contract from first principles. That is to say, are things getting worse or are things getting better, and why? The second reason I mention Sandy Hook is to remind everyone that the concept of liberty is not about now. It would be very tempting for the other side to spend this debate talking about Trump or the recent developments in the privacy landscape as evidence that we are sacrificing our liberties. In fact, that comprised a large part of Genevieve's speech. But let me save everyone some time. There are policies that all 6 debaters tonight fundamentally disagree with. Muslim travel bans, Guantanamo Bay, stop and frisk. These are dangerous, these are racist, and these are violations of some of the core tenets and freedoms that we hold dear. And we don't need to defend that on this side of the House. Simply listing status quo examples of where liberty has been restricted under the pretense of security does not win you this debate. It simply proves that occasionally the equation gets it wrong. But as we've seen with gun control reform and with many other examples, there are times where the equation gets it right. So it is more useful for us not to trade anecdotes tonight, but to try to establish a premise on which we can all engage and use that as the normative basis for a productive debate. Tonight, we, the opposition, are here to make the normative case for a human-centered security policy, for a policy that is adaptive towards burgeoning threats, that respects essential rights, and that responds to criticisms about its flaws and its oversights. This is the promise of security. A security apparatus cannot always get it right. It is, by definition, an invasive and heavy-handed part of government aimed at stopping bad people and bad things trying to do us all harm. But what we will prove tonight is that it remains an essential part of our grand bargain, an essential part of the state limitation of liberties that we accept in order to ensure peace and stability for our most vulnerable. It remains a system that has worked, a system that has produced an era of unprecedented freedom, and yes, a system that we must continually fight to keep honest. But before I continue, it falls on me to introduce our debaters tonight. Speaking first is my friend Genevieve Athis, a second-year historian at Christ Church. Genevieve is a long way from her native home of Liverpool and an even longer way away from the Everest Base Camp, which she summited earlier this summer. Genevieve is speaking for the government, though if my Facebook feed is anything to go by, she was more than willing to sacrifice the liberty of her Nepalese mountain guides for the promise of her security. joking aside, I'm very proud to be debating across from Genevieve. She's a good friend, and we're very proud to have her tonight. Genevieve Athos, everyone. Speaking second for the government is a man I have great admiration for. That is Mr. Anthony Romero, the executive director of the ACLU. A passionate activist for many of the things that I believe deeply, I was a bit worried that he would try to color all of us on the opposing side tonight as Trump apologists or neoconservative hawks. So before we get there, as Genevieve accurately predicted, I'd just like to state clearly and for the record, Your Honor, that I am a Canadian. Ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Romero. And speaking third is what I'm told is a perennial flower to the Oxford Union's bouquet, Jay Johnson, a distinguished US policymaker and Obama's former Secretary of Homeland Security. I am told this is the third time that Secretary Johnson is speaking at the Union. You'd think that all the pre-flight security checks would have scared him away by now, but I guess you get a few perks when you used to run the TSA. Mr. President, these are your guests, and they are most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, we are freer and more secure today than we have ever been in human history. To begin deconstructing this debate, let's parse out exactly what we are talking about tonight. There are two parts to this motion. First, that we have sacrificed our liberty, and second, that we did so in pursuit of a false promise of security. My goal in the opening part of this argument will be to prove that we remain, for the most part, free and unencumbered, and that we have not been sold a false bill of health on our security. So, with regards to the first contention, the sacrifice of liberty, it can seem tempting to observe developments like the bulk collection of personal metadata as a regression on our base freedoms. But what people forget is that before the present, you had to directly submit your communications to the state via the National Postal Service. And before that, secret programs like Minaret and Shamrock would collect and analyze the content of all signals communications, something that even the status quo metadata won't allow for. And so I say this mainly to suggest that there was never a golden age of liberty. There was no romantic pre-war period that we are fighting to protect. If anything, we are living in an era that has seen the greatest flourishing of personal and civil liberties of any time in modern history. The former political editor of the New Statesman, Raphael Baer, sums it up beautifully in a 2009 treatise on liberty. Quote, "By fixating on the details of current state oppression, we miss the big historical picture. Go back a couple of centuries, and most of us lived in perpetual fear of violence. We couldn't read or write. Independent thought was a sin. Women were property. Children were laborers. Even 50 years ago, most of us were restrained by the bonds of class deference, rigid gender roles, and sexual prurience. This has all been swept away. We have the maximum political, moral, and cultural license of any people ever." End quote. To suggest, therefore, that we have sacrificed our liberty is to miss the reality that we are increasingly free. We are increasingly free to express what we think through mediums like Facebook, to scrutinize the actions of our government through avenues like the ACLU and civil society, and overall, that we are increasingly free in the face of cultural taboos, sexual taboos, and mores that have all utterly been shattered. Keep that in mind. Every time the government restricts some small part of our liberty, it is one step back after 6 steps forward. And believe me, as someone who is a first-generation immigrant, I understand the basis of the skepticism. I understand the basis of the wariness. But the suggestion that we have abrogated all or even most of our liberties in pursuit of some ephemeral security ideal is simply ahistorical and a type of fear-mongering in itself. The same can be said for the second part of this motion, which claims that the restrictions on liberty have been made in pursuit of an unachievable or false state of security. But this is entirely untrue. Steven Pinker writes in his seminal work, Angels of Our Better Nature, that for millennia, violence has been in decline around the world, and that now is probably the most peaceful time in the history of man to be alive. He uses quantitative analysis of various public data sets to prove, quote, that there have been declines in military conflict, homicide, genocide, torture, criminal justice, and the treatment of children, homosexuals, animals, and ethnic minorities. He then goes on to suggest various reasons for this, amongst which he includes the state monopoly on force and the use of its autonomy to impose limitations on individual liberties that might otherwise tend us towards violence, exploitation, and recrimination. So what exactly is he talking about? What are hate speech laws, if not restrictions on our freedom of speech? What are gun licenses, if not restrictions on the right to bear arms? What is a seatbelt or a public health quarantine, if not a restriction on liberty? At the end of the day, we accept limitations on our liberty all the time as part of the process of strengthening and protecting our own society. The only reason people get more hesitant about national security in particular is that the events in question are far less common, far less predictable, they're far less frequent. This is the black swan fallacy that faces policymakers in this space. They are unfortunately tasked with trying to protect us from the unimaginable, the Sandy Hooks, the nuclear bombs, the total shutdowns of our financial infrastructure. Gun regulators can point to reduced gun deaths. Advocacy groups can point to increased prosecutions for hate speech. But how can you ever quantify the number of infrequent and major catastrophes that we have overcome or that we have averted? How can you convince a public that a measure is necessary when the very efficacy of that measure renders the need for it less obviously clear? And for that reason, that's the first argument. So let this be an antidote. For every example the other side wants to trot out where we limit liberty X and this did not increase security, there is another example where we limited liberty Y and it did increase security. And so as I mentioned at the outset, this cannot be a debate about anecdotes and cherry-picked examples, because then we will never find a normative premise that we can engage on. I ask you to remember this throughout their speech. Our security and our freedom have markedly increased over time. Moreover, it's important for us not to let ourselves be fully imbued with a cynicism about our government. I know it's very easy to become cynical about government in the modern political moment that we live in, but the rapid pace of globalization and digitization has, frankly put, left our government struggling to keep up with the pace of innovation. And oftentimes in response, government, which is not by design an actor that is very good at developing nimble and highly tailored policy, ends up overcorrecting. And these overcorrections, which they make in response to the perceived expansions to civil liberties that it observes, is actually more a reflection on the bluntness of the instruments that it has to use rather than something attributable to malicious intent. And so by way of compromise on this point, I think that our normative stance in this debate is not exclusive to the mandates of organizations like Mr. Romero's. On the whole, we are living free and safe lives, but we still need ACLUs and innocence projects and democracy watches. You will get no disagreement from me there. That we have groups like this to fight against undemocratic policies and retrenchment is a testament to the strength of our civil society, and funny enough, is also a proof of our freedom. One last note on freedom. The other side will have to engage with what happens when two freedoms come into tension with one another. Take the Facebooks and Googles of the world. We learned the hard way that the very liberty we have been given by these technologies can be weaponized to undermine our essential freedoms, like fair elections. And so in response, we all implicitly support government efforts to hold these companies to account and to curb their collection of our data because we understand that trade-offs are necessary to keep people safe. To some extent, therefore, the new security measures we are seeing are the price of the rapid technological innovations that we are observing, not something necessarily new or dangerous. When we used to walk, gates and checkpoints were the obstacles we faced along the way. Then suddenly we could drive, and we were free to travel across our nations, suffering only the occasional speed limit or seatbelt. And now we can fly to different worlds. For the price of a luggage check, we can access lands that for most of our human forebears were things they could only imagine. To conclude, I will leave you with this. On October 31st, 1958, the liberal philosopher Isaiah Berlin delivered his Two Concepts of Liberty address before this university. In the lecture, Berlin suggests, quote, "Men are largely interdependent, and no man's activity is so completely private as never to obstruct the lives of others in any way. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. The liberty of some must develop and depend on the restraint of others." Who are the some and who are the others? After all, it must be said that while too much government regulation can make you unfree, the absence of government makes you unfree too. Sometimes we limit civil liberties in order to protect other freedoms. Other times, we limit civil liberties in order to make our society fairer, safer, and more humane. Overall, this is an agreement that has been borne out by the evidence and that has withstood the test of time. It is one that has made us both freer and more secure than any other time in human history. And so for those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose tonight, and thank you so much for having me.